Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on which part of the world you're tuning in from. Thanks for joining us today for today's IVA Talk, the second of the IVA Talk series. IVA has initiated this monthly online lecture series by global leaders in the eye care sector to share their thoughts, experiences, projects, and learnings for the benefit of the broader eye care professional community. I'm so delighted my good friend and colleague Nick Martin is speaking today on influencing and directing social change. Nick is the Deputy CEO of the Fred Hollows Foundation, an international NGO working to end avoidable blindness and vision loss worldwide. He has worked extensively across government, the not-for-profit sector, international development, and public campaigns for 15 years. He's based in Sydney, Australia. In India, Nick was instrumental in organizing and leading the See Now campaign with Amitabh Bachchan as a brand ambassador. The campaign conducted during 2019-20 across 5 key districts in UP, and the following campaign in many more districts used radio, television, print, social media, WhatsApp, and SMS to provide information on eye health issues, local services, and how to access them. Nick is an experienced organizational leader with skills across strategy, market entry, policy, government relations, campaigning, advertising, communications, fundraising, research, and public policy with a strong focus on results. His talk will be approximately for 10 minutes with a 10-minute open discussion following that. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Vinod, and thank you to IVI for organising this wonderful lecture series. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's joining online. I'm, of course, joining you from Sydney, Australia, and it's customary here in Australia for us to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we meet on, the Indigenous custodians here in Australia, and I am on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. And welcome to people around the world and also to people in particular in India. As Vinod said, my session today is on influencing and directing social change, which I think is a really important area for the eye health community to engage in. It's really about how we shape and change the discourses that are going to have an enormous influence on global health and on eye health in particular. In today's session, I really wanted to touch on 3 really high-level areas to talk about why we need an agenda for social change as an eye health sector, how we can approach social change, what are some of the things that we can do and some of the movements that we can engage with, talk briefly about some of the examples of change and how they've been successful in the past, and also wanted to delve into really the See Now campaign. As Vinod mentioned, it's been a significant thing that the Fred Hollows Foundation, in coalition with many wonderful people in India and great organisations on the ground there, that we've been able to deliver and continue to deliver, particularly in Uttar Pradesh. And then finally, to just engage in some discussion with some Q&A as well. So jumping into today's session, it's always useful, I think, to just start with framing these discussions broadly. Of course, social change isn't something that's new to all of us, but it is something that has a very long history out there in the community. And of course, Nelson Mandela, an iconic figure in social change, someone who was instrumental in leading the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and then of course went on to become such a significant global statesperson. And he had, I think, a really great quote about what is social change. And he said that action without vision is only passing time. And vision without action is merely daydreaming. But vision with action can change the world. And I think this is a really powerful statement about the ways that the eye health sector could start thinking about our process of change and the things that we want to achieve, combining our vision for change with concrete actions to deliver real impact. So broadly, why should we be interested in social change as a sector? We do many things incredibly successful. We train a great workforce, we perform surgeries, we distribute glasses, We organise eye camps and other interventions to restore people's sight. Why should we be connected to an agenda for social change? Well, of course, these numbers are, in the last 24 hours, a little bit out of date, but they come from the Vision Loss Expert Group. And of course, in the last 24 hours, we've seen some of these numbers shift a little. What we do know is that there are more than 30 million people around the world who are blind, and there are hundreds of millions more who suffer from severe visual impairment. We also know that whilst the rates of blindness have declined, vision loss is actually flatlining around the world. And of course, what we're dealing with is, despite all the things that we do as organisations, we are seeing the numbers of people who are blind and vision impaired growing. This is a global problem for global health, that we have these numbers actually increasing. We also know that blindness and vision loss is largely centred in developing countries. 89 to 90% of the problem exists in developing countries. And also, when you look at the regions where it exists, more than 62% is contained within the Asian regions: South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia. Overwhelming prevalence in countries in the region of India. And we also know that there's a gender dynamic for blindness and vision loss as well. 55% of the world's blind are also women. So stepping through this, a classic tool when you're looking at analysing elements of social changes, to use a pestle analysis. And I think this really helps us to underline that blindness and vision loss are issues of development, fairness, and equity. And therefore, they become a very good subject for processes of social change. So reflecting on something like a pestle analysis and looking at some of the political factors at play, we know that governments choose what to regulate, fund, and resource in areas of healthcare. And all too often, eye health is a lower order priority for governments in their political decision making. We also know that it's an economic issue, that without economic development and scarce resources being deployed to healthcare in general and eye health specifically, that there won't be further development unlocked. We know that eye health has a direct correlation with lifting people out of poverty. We know that there's a social dimension. Vision loss disproportionately impacts marginalised groups in society. And similarly, there are technological and environmental factors. Technologies are often developed for profit and are often contained within wealthy communities and not spread beyond that to those more marginalised groups. And also we know that environmental sustainability is an increasingly important trend, and that eye care has to respond to that. And finally, we know that the legal and regulatory regime in countries does actually have an impact on the ability of people to access eye care services. So this is just a convenient tool for us to, I guess, really start the conversation on how you might approach eye health and eye care as a social change issue. So how do we structure processes to deliver social change? This is really getting into some of the mechanics of how you might look at eye health and social change being connected. But before we go into some of those processes, it's important to just reflect on some of those really big, we call them meta trends, that are impacting on eye health. We know, of course, that there's the new global compact, the Sustainable Development Goals, and within that, there's a healthcare objective. We also know that while there are two measures there that really do relate to eye care, that eye care is an essential part of the Sustainable Development Goals. As a sector, work eye health into the SDGs to find our relevant home within that very important global compact. But there are also really big meta trends that are relevant to us as well. All around the world, there are new social movements that are reshaping and changing political landscapes, and political decision makers are very responsive to these right now. In the United States, we have the Black Lives Matter protests and movement, similar movements here in Australia and in other developed countries, but also we're hearing calls right now for the decolonisation of aid and development, something very relevant for an organisation like the Fred Hollows Foundation. Similarly, we're seeing obviously the rise in digital technologies, and they're a wonderful leveller, as we've all discovered in this COVID-19 environment. on a number of Zoom calls, Microsoft Team calls, and other video conferencing platforms. All of the accessibility of these platforms is now available for everyone around the world. And what that's driving at a trend level is the ability to link up offline activism, people doing things in their community directly, with online activism as well. And we're seeing those trends converge and converge at an accelerated pace today. And of course, very relevant to us, we're seeing that COVID-19 is leading to a renewed focus on global health and global development. The expression that none of us are safe until all of us are safe has become very popular in how we respond to COVID-19. It's a global pandemic and it affects all of humanity equally, and it's leading these renewed calls for funding for global health. So all of these meta trends are really impacting on us as a sector, and it's important that we're aware of them in how we might shape some of our processes for social change. But it's also important for us to reflect on other very successful campaigns that have occurred. We have seen very big changes in the world over the last 20 years. Campaigns around the Millennium Development Goals, particular humanitarian challenges, have been successful in prioritising and redirecting funding to particular causes. Of course, the elimination of polio campaign has been uniquely successful in the global health space. But also we've seen very, very successful campaigns across the world for debt relief, the Jubilee debt campaign. Many people said when that first started that it couldn't possibly be successful, and has been really successful in seeing widespread debt cancellation in developing countries. And of course, in more of a consumer-focused space, we've seen the rise of things like fair trade and social enterprise support for fair labour rights, fair standards, fair production of goods and services around the world. So NGOs, civil society have been very successful over previous decades in elevating issues for social change, and there's really no reason why eye health couldn't be one of those issues for the future. So this rather busy slide tells us a bit of a story on how we deliver social change. And if you look on the far right of the slide, you'll see a column there called impact, which is really the end result of what we talk about as social change. For some, it might be a goal far off in the distance, but it's certainly something aspirational. It might be something like ending avoidable blindness and vision loss worldwide. But measuring progress against that impact and that impact goal is obviously very important as we start to build our work towards the objective. But then in that second last column, the outcomes column, when you really start to unpack social change, it really is about three types of power. No social change occurs anywhere in the world without fundamental shifts in power. And those categories of power can be defined as financial power, and it might be something as simple as increased funding, political power, having a stronger voice or stronger awareness with decision makers in government or in the business community. And it's also people power. Growing public support and awareness is critical for achieving social change. So all of our activity when we talk about social change tends to be pointed towards shifting one or two or all of those elements of power in order to deliver that impact. So when we start to talk about the strategic choices that we make in social change, that often takes us to a number of areas. It takes us to things like awareness building campaigns, public mobilisations for support. It can be things like fundraising drives, trying to mobilise people and mobilise resources behind some of those objectives. But it can also be behaviour change. It can be having advocacy and lobbying to government. And it can also be building coalitions and ambassadors to help drive that. And all of these strategies obviously using different techniques and tactics, whether it's reaching out to the media, using digital platforms, or traditional things like TV advertising, outdoor advertising, print and other things. And finally, when we start to look at our processes of social change, it's so important to identify opportunities. These are really those issues or values or evidence or moments which become entry points into our larger conversations for change. So rather than just talking about ending avoidable blindness, we might identify a moment, like a World Sight Day, where we see that as an opportunity to structure some of our campaigning or mobilisation work. We might identify a particular issue, a law, a regulation that needs to be changed, which gives us an opportunity to as well talk about the broader issue of ending avoidable blindness. So this flowchart really gives us a bit of a way of working through some of the ways that we approach social change, and also talking about some of the strategies and techniques that we might use to unlock critically those elements of power. In this final section, I really wanted to just talk about a case study, which is the See Now campaign in India. Of course, many of you would be familiar with this and would have seen this deployed through 2 phases of activity in Uttar Pradesh. Our first pilot phase focused on just 5 jurisdictions, but our much larger second phase focused on 30 jurisdictions. And of course, we're looking at a next phase of activity right now. And what was our objective with the See Now campaign? It was really to increase awareness of eye health and to drive service uptake in UP and in India more broadly with some of these later phases. And really, if you look at it from a social change perspective, what we're trying to do is to really increase some of that political power as well. Importantly, all the activity that happens through See Now gives us a really important advocacy platform to talk to government about the need for investment in eye health in India as well. So, of course, standing behind this campaign, as Vinod mentioned at the beginning, was the incredible celebrity power of a very generous man, Shri Amitabh Bachchan. Of course, he's so well known to audiences, not just in India, but right around the world. He is possibly the world's biggest movie star, and we couldn't have been more pleased to have his very generous support for the See Now campaign. Having an ambassador of this standing behind our work obviously helped us to not only connect with people in the community, but also to lift general awareness of eye health with government. And of course, Shri Bachchan's got an incredible history of working on social causes. Now, of course, with us on vision loss and avoidable blindness, but of course previously for polio eradication and a number of other significant social causes. So part of our campaign methodology in approaching See Now was to really have 2 areas of work focused towards those objectives, as I mentioned, but there was an element of mass communication, and that was using traditional platforms like TV, outdoor billboards, newspapers to really connect with a broad general audience and to raise that awareness of eye health. But then we had a really important secondary area of work, and that was community outreach. And that was directly connected towards driving demand towards those eye health services. We utilised, of course, community health workers, the wonderful ushers, to take the message door to door. But we also utilised some really creative and new ways of connecting with people, done for the first time in health campaigns in any sector, using things like WhatsApp messaging to connect with people, email, and also telemarketing referral centres to receive calls through a missed call, and then to connect with people directly and point them towards their nearest eye care service. And obviously we were looking at a very clear referral pathway through this campaign as well, starting with comprehensive eye care services provided in hospitals and also outreach eye camps that provided all forms of eye care and treatment. And then of course using optometric services, eye screenings and refraction, and then very basic vision screening as a primary form of service delivery as well. And as I mentioned, digital engagement was important, not just on things like WhatsApp, but also having Shri Bachchan using his personal Twitter, which of course has millions of followers on it, to promote the campaign. And as someone who wears glasses himself, he was very open in talking about the stigma that he was concerned about early in his career as someone who was wearing glasses. And of course, that point of empathy was really important for the people we were seeking to influence. Really critically here, the See Now campaign wasn't just an initiative of the Fred Hollows Foundation, and it remains firmly anchored in an idea of an active coalition. And there were some very important partners who made this successful. Alongside the Fred Hollows Foundation, Essilor and Vision for Life were a critical partner, both for financial support, but also for their networks in India. And Sightsavers, a very long-standing friend of the Fred Hollows Foundation, has always been critical in this campaign, and they helped us in both the pilot phase and were instrumental in the second phase of work. And of course, Vision 2020, as the peak body of India, were very important in mobilising both government resources, but also the sector broadly. And then, of course, we had a number of very significant organisations. I can't mention them all, but of course, IVI, Sadhguru, Mission for Vision, Sankara, others were all involved in this as well as coalition partners. Thank you to all of them. And in terms of our outcomes, in terms of what we achieved, particularly with this second phase of work, which was much larger than our pilot phase, this really takes us towards being able to unpack, I guess, some of the lessons of this as a social change intervention. We had a pretty rigorous monitoring and evaluation framework around assessing campaign effectiveness. That, of course, involved things like monitoring social media and quantitative research work around some of those campaign metrics, but it also involved us talking to the beneficiaries as they were accessing services. And what we were able to discover from this was that on turning up to a hospital, for example, 49% had heard of the See Now campaign or seen campaign collateral, which is a very high recognition rate for people who are coming through the hospital, sometimes just as a matter of course. We also saw a very real lift in attendance at iCamp services. This was different in different localities. In more urban areas, we saw a higher lift, and in rural areas, less of a lift. But as a norm across all iCamps, we saw a 14% increase in attendance at those iCamp services, meaning the campaign was effective in driving people towards them. And in vision centres, we saw a very large 62% increase as well. So people with a basic eye problem were more encouraged to attend those vision centres for a checkup or for treatment. So of course the campaign, this is just some of the colour and movement. You can see some of our wonderful ASHA workers, some of the materials that were distributed door to door, people appearing for the iCamp services, some of the vans that were travelling around with the messaging as well. There was enormous activity around the campaign, as well as media attention and focus, of course, which helped us to really lift public awareness. And obviously replicating this each time, it's become something that's more and more refined with each phase of See Now that we deploy. And really now we're heading towards planning the next phase of See Now, obviously deepening and strengthening our work, working with all those wonderful partners in Uttar Pradesh, but also looking more broadly at how the campaign can be deployed in other jurisdictions and other provinces, and also how perhaps it can be deployed as an India-wide overarching message to support everyone's great work in India. From the Fred Hollows Foundation's point of view, we see this as an initiative that we were catalytic in, but it's certainly not something that we view as ours alone. It's something that's really owned by the sector in India, and we really want it to be used broadly and widely to help strengthen all the work that happens there. And of course, as I mentioned, we see it as well, lifting general awareness should also serve as an encouragement for us to pursue an advocacy agenda for change alongside our very great service delivery and awareness raising work. So that really brings me to the end of my presentation. Hopefully through unpacking the example of See Now, you can see a very practical example of some of the techniques that we've used to try and drive social change. But hopefully as well in some of those earlier sections, you've also been able to see some of the theoretical approaches, but also some of the rationale for why this should be a priority for the eye health community globally. And certainly through the leadership of people like Peter Holland in the IAPB, we're wanting to see a lot more of this happening. And I know Peter's a very big advocate of engaging with this sort of agenda as well. So I'll leave it there and hand back to Vinod, but I wanted to say thank you again for having me today. It's always a great pleasure to connect with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for that broad perspective as well as that practical example on See Now that you provided. We've been involved with CNOW, and we've seen firsthand, the great work that you and Fred Hollows have done, through the campaign. Um, Nick, just to unpack it a little bit, I know you and Fred Hollows have been involved with campaigns in so many different parts of the world. Just wondering whether you could kind of talk a little bit about what the difference is when you work, in different parts of the world, developing versus developed, or even within developing, you got to kind of tailor make it, based on where you're really working on it. So I was just wondering whether you could highlight and how you did what you did in India, uh, you know, making sure all the learnings from what you've done in other parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely, Vinod. Thanks for that. And it is so important that with every single campaign that you do, that you're very aware of context and situation. You've always got to be analysing the social, the political, the regulatory, the cultural aspects of campaigning. And that was absolutely the case for CNOW in India. We've used CNOW as a campaigning platform in the United States as well. We're looking at it in other countries. And you always have to be aware of the differences in country by country. But the great, universalizing message, I guess, is that around the world, blindness is experienced in the same way by many, many people. And also, as I mentioned, things like access to technology really make some of these campaigning techniques much more universal. So as we look at things like the next phase of work in India, we're obviously looking at not just what we've learned through the CNOW 2 phases previous, but also looking at broadly how others have approached, campaigns for awareness raising and social change as well. And some of those lessons, interestingly, they're not drawn from health communities. And this is an important point, Vinod. It's we've got to know what we don't know, and we've got to know what we can learn from other sectors as well. Some of those are allied sectors like international development broadly, but they're also often places like marketing and digital social media where we can learn some really great lessons about how to promote our cause. So making sure you're taking all of those lessons into your campaign model, digesting them and applying them appropriately is critical. And I must say that you cannot do that from Sydney, Australia. You have to do that with really strong input from local organisations and campaign partners. And it's why we take that coalition approach whenever we do this work.
And that brings me to the next one. For someone like you who, has got such a strong, hard social leanings, what does success look like? When you do something like this, how do you define success? What is it?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to be focused on big change. We should never be conservative in our approach. Eye health, blindness, vision loss is an injustice. We know that people are blind and remain blind because of poverty, because of a lack of development, because of inequity in the global system. We should never shy away, I think, from prosecuting that case. But it is so important in structuring social change that you might have that objective on the horizon, but really being clear about what are some of those targeted successes, wins along the way that build towards that bigger picture. And it might be, as simple as, convincing government to direct a greater proportion of a health budget towards areas that are aligned to eye health. It might be securing greater training for a primary healthcare workforce. All of those wins build towards a bigger picture, and taking those wins and celebrating them as well as contributors towards the overarching vision is really important.
And my very last question, Nick, is so when you do these kind of big initiatives around the world, I'm sure you are quite keen that whatever change you're doing is sustainable. So in terms of what system, you already touched on that a bit before in the previous answer, but from your perspective, how do you make sure that you work towards that at the same time as making the campaign successful?
Yeah, and this really goes back to those just released vision loss expert group numbers that have come out. And, of course, what we know is that everything that we do as NGOs, as development organisations, as service delivery providers, we're obviously changing every individual who we're able to access and treat. But the numbers are continuing to grow. We have more people who are blind and vision impaired today than we did in 2015 and then we did in 2010. So these numbers are increasing because people are living longer and the population is growing. So unless we actually have those big sustainable shifts in financing for eye health around the world, we're not going to see those rates continuing declining at all. So we do need to be focused on the big systemic changes, and that's really taking you to sustainability. And I guess my proposition, Vinod, is that without an agenda for that big social change, we will never be really successful as organisations. We'll do amazing transformations for individuals, but we won't ever be successful in our overall mission. So making sure that we are focused on those big changes, that we're using techniques of social change and running the campaigns and the awareness raising work that we can becomes very important.
So thank you again so much, Nick, for taking your time. Thanks for the leadership of the Fred Hollows Foundation and your leadership in making a difference around the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Vinod, and congratulations to RBI for this really wonderful opportunity. It's been great to connect with everyone. Congratulations, Vinod, and to the whole team at RBI.
Thank you.
You.